In the year 400 of the Common Era, while Rome struggled against barbarian invasions and Constantinople fortified its walls, a civilization on the other side of the world reached heights that would not be seen again for 1,000 years. In the courts of the Gupta Empire stretching across northern India from the Ganges plain to the Arabian Sea, poets recited verses that still echo through the centuries. Mathematicians developed concepts that would transform human thought, and astronomers calculated the movements of planets with precision that would astound medieval Europe. This was India's golden age, a period of such extraordinary achievement that later generations would speak of it with the same reverence that Europeans reserved for classical Athens or the Renaissance. Yet, within a century and a half, this magnificent civilization would lie in ruins, its cities abandoned, its trade routes severed, its universities destroyed. The story of how the Gupta Empire fell is not simply a tale of military conquest or dynastic failure. It is a profound lesson in how civilizations collapse, how the very structures that enable greatness can become the mechanisms of destruction, and how human decisions, made in moments of crisis, can echo across centuries. To understand what was lost, we must first understand what the Gupta Empire achieved. Around 320 CE, Chandragupta I established a dynasty that would unite much of northern India under a single political and cultural framework. But it was his grandson, Chandragupta II, ruling from 380 to 415 CE, who would preside over the empire's zenith. His reign represented something remarkable in human history, a period where political stability, economic prosperity, and cultural achievement reinforced each other in a virtuous cycle that seemed, to those living through it, as though it might last forever. The political structure of the Gupta Empire was, in many ways, ahead of its time. Unlike the rigid centralization of contemporary Rome or Persia, the Guptas developed a sophisticated system of decentralized governance. At the empire's heart sat the emperor, the Maharajadhira, the king of kings, who maintained direct control over the core territories along the Ganges. But beyond this heartland stretched a network of feudatory kingdoms, each ruled by local dynasties who acknowledged Gupta supremacy, paid tribute, and provided military support when called upon. These Samantas, as they were known, enjoyed considerable autonomy in managing their territories. They collected taxes, administered justice, and maintained local armies. In return, they received legitimacy, access to imperial trade networks, and protection from external threats. This system worked brilliantly during the empire's peak. It allowed for flexibility and local adaptation while maintaining a broader unity of purpose. A merchant traveling from the eastern coast to the western ports moved through dozens of different jurisdictions, yet everywhere the Gupta coinage was accepted. Sanskrit served as the language of administration and high culture, and the emperor's authority, however distant, provided a framework of predictability and order. The genius of this arrangement was that it harnessed local knowledge and initiative while maintaining the benefits of scale. Local rulers understood their territories, their peoples, their particular challenges and opportunities. The central government didn't need to micromanage distant provinces. Instead, it focused on maintaining the infrastructure, both physical and cultural, that allowed the entire system to function. This political arrangement enabled an extraordinary economic flowering. The Gupta Empire sat at the crossroads of the ancient world's most important trade routes. To the west, caravan routes led through mountain passes to Persia, and beyond that, to the Mediterranean world. To the east, maritime trade connected Indian ports to Southeast Asia and, eventually, to China. The Guptas didn't just facilitate this trade, they actively cultivated it through standardized coinage, maintained roads, protection of merchants, and diplomatic relations with foreign powers. Gold coins bearing the images of Gupta emperors circulated from Rome to Java. Indian merchants became a fixture in the ports of the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. Spices, textiles, particularly the fine cotton that Romans called woven wind, precious stones, and metalwork flowed out of India, while gold, silver, horses, and luxury goods flowed in. The scale of this commerce was staggering by ancient standards. Archaeological excavations have revealed Roman coins in sites across India, evidence of the consistent trade that connected the Mediterranean economy to the Indian Ocean world. Indian pepper, so valuable in Rome that it was sometimes used as currency, traveled thousands of miles from the Malabar coast to Italian dining tables. Chinese silk passed through Indian intermediaries on its way west. The famous port of Barbaricum, near modern Karachi, handled ships from Egypt and Arabia. Broach, on the western coast, served as the primary export point for goods from central India. On the eastern seaboard, Tamralipti in Bengal connected India to the maritime networks of Southeast Asia. This trade required sophisticated commercial institutions. Merchant guilds, known as Shrini, organized commerce across vast distances, pooling capital for large ventures, providing credit to members, and maintaining standards of quality and honest dealing. These guilds were not mere economic organizations, but social institutions that provided identity and community to their members. A merchant traveling far from home could find support from guild members in distant cities. The guilds also served political functions, negotiating with local rulers on behalf of their members, sometimes even administering entire quarters of cities. The state recognized and protected guild autonomy, understanding that commercial prosperity depended on allowing merchants to organize their own affairs according to the customs and requirements of trade. Banking and credit systems reached levels of sophistication that would not be seen again in India for many centuries. Bankers, often from specific communities with long traditions in finance, accepted deposits, made loans, and facilitated long-distance transfers of funds through sophisticated instruments that functioned much like modern letters of credit. A merchant in one city could deposit funds with a banker who would issue a note that could be redeemed by a correspondent banker in another city, eliminating the need to transport large quantities of coin over dangerous routes. Interest rates were regulated by custom and sometimes by law, balancing the needs of borrowers for capital against the rights of lenders to fair return. But it wasn't just the volume of trade that mattered. The Guptas demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of what we might today call monetary policy. Their gold coins, dinars, maintained consistent weight and purity, creating confidence among traders and facilitating long-distance commerce. This standardization represented a form of public infrastructure as important as roads or ports. When a merchant in Alexandria accepted a Gupta coin, they did so knowing its value was backed not just by the metal content, but by the stability and reach of the empire itself. This was soft power in its purest form, the ability to project authority and inspire confidence across vast distances without the need for military garrisons at every crossroads. The economic prosperity created by this trade funded one of history's great cultural flowerings. In the court of Chandragupta II, the poet Kalidasa composed works that remain masterpieces of Sanskrit literature. His play, Shakuntala, would later inspire Goethe, while his epic poems demonstrated a sophistication of language and metaphor that rivaled anything produced in classical Greece or Rome. The opening verses of his epic Kumara Sambhava display a control of Sanskrit's complex grammar and an ability to layer meanings that has challenged translators for centuries. His descriptive passages, whether depicting the Himalayas or the psychology of separated lovers, combine precision of observation with emotional depth in ways that transcend cultural boundaries. But Kalidasa was just one star in a constellation of literary achievement. Across the empire, royal courts patronized poets, philosophers, and scholars. The production of literature was not merely entertainment or propaganda. It served a crucial political function, creating a shared cultural identity that transcended local loyalties and linguistic differences. A Brahmin in distant Kashmir and another in Bengal might never meet, might speak different mother tongues, might live under different local rulers, but they shared a common education in Sanskrit, a common reverence for certain texts, and a common participation in a cultural sphere that defined what it meant to be part of the Gupta world. The educational system that produced this cultural elite was itself a remarkable achievement. Young boys from Brahmin families, and, increasingly, from other upper castes, began their education around age 7 under the guidance of a guru. This education was not merely vocational training but a comprehensive introduction to a cultural tradition. Students learned to recite and interpret the Vedas, the most ancient Hindu texts. They studied grammar through the systematic analysis laid out by Panini centuries earlier, learning to parse and construct Sanskrit sentences with logical precision. They learned mathematics and astronomy, subjects considered essential for calculating the proper times for rituals. They studied philosophy, engaging with the complex arguments between different schools of thought about the nature of reality, knowledge, and liberation. This education was residential and intensive. Students lived with their teacher, often for years, serving him and learning through a combination of memorization, discussion, and practical application. The guru-shishya relationship, the bond between teacher and student, was considered sacred and lifelong. A student's primary loyalty, even above family, was to the guru who had initiated him into knowledge. This system created networks of intellectual lineages that could span centuries, with each generation of teachers transmitting accumulated wisdom to the next while adding their own insights and interpretations. For those who wished to pursue learning beyond this basic education, centers of higher learning offered opportunities. The university at Nalanda, though reaching its full glory slightly after the Gupta period proper, was founded in the 5th century and represented the culmination of trends that had been developing throughout the Gupta era. Here, hundreds of monks and lay students studied not just Buddhist philosophy, but logic, epistemology, medicine, and linguistics. The curriculum was demanding, the standards high, and graduation from Nalanda conferred prestige throughout Asia. Chinese pilgrims like Xuanzang would travel thousands of miles to study at Nalanda, and their accounts provide invaluable records of the intellectual vibrancy of Indian institutions. This cultural unity rested on a religious foundation that was both firm and flexible. The Gupta emperors were primarily Hindu, followers of Vishnu, and they sponsored the construction of magnificent temples and the performance of elaborate Vedic rituals. This represented a Hindu revival after centuries, during which Buddhism had enjoyed imperial patronage under rulers like Ashoka, but the Gupta approach was notably tolerant. Buddhist monasteries continued to flourish, receiving donations from the imperial family and wealthy merchants. The great university at Nalanda, founded in the 5th century, would become one of the world's premier centers of Buddhist learning, attracting students from across Asia. Jain communities, too, practiced their faith without persecution. This religious pluralism wasn't simply a matter of tolerance in the modern sense. It reflected a sophisticated understanding that cultural vitality came from diversity, that intellectual life benefited from the interaction of different traditions, and that political stability required accommodation of different communities rather than forced uniformity. Nowhere was the Gupta achievement more remarkable than in mathematics and science. In workshops and royal observatories, scholars developed ideas that would transform human understanding. The concept of zero as both a placeholder and a number in its own right, a notion so fundamental to modern mathematics that we can barely imagine thinking without it, was formalized during this period. The decimal place value system, which would eventually replace the cumbersome Roman numerals throughout the world, reached its mature form under the Guptas. The mathematician and astronomer Aryabhata, working in the late 5th century, calculated pi to unprecedented accuracy, developed sophisticated methods for solving algebraic equations, and proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system in which the Earth rotated on its axis 1,000 years before Copernicus would scandalize Christian Europe with the same idea. These weren't isolated individual achievements. They emerged from an institutional framework that supported sustained intellectual inquiry. Centers of learning, both Buddhist monasteries and Hindu temple complexes, maintained libraries, supported scholars, and created communities where ideas could be debated and refined. The patronage system that funded poets also funded mathematicians and astronomers. A successful merchant might endow a library or support a scholar as both an act of religious merit and a demonstration of status. The state, through the emperor and through local rulers, provided resources and prestige. What we see in the Gupta period is the creation of what we might today call a knowledge economy, where intellectual achievement was valued not just for its practical applications, but as an end in itself, a marker of civilizational sophistication. The physical evidence of this golden age remains visible today. The Iron Pillar of Delhi, erected during the reign of Chandragupta II, stands as testament to Gupta metallurgical skill. Over 7 meters tall and weighing more than 6 tons, this pillar of rust-resistant iron has stood exposed to the elements for 16 centuries without corroding, a feat that metallurgists struggled to explain until modern analysis revealed the sophisticated understanding of material science that its creation required. Temple complexes built during the Gupta period established architectural forms that would influence Indian building for centuries. The graceful curves of Gupta sculpture, the serene faces of Buddha figures and Hindu deities would inspire artistic traditions across Asia. From the temples of Java to the cave monasteries of China, this was not a perfect society. The caste system, which would become increasingly rigid in later centuries, already structured social relations in ways that limited mobility and opportunity for large segments of the population. Women, though they could be educated and sometimes wielded significant influence, lived under legal and social restrictions. Slavery existed, though in forms different from the chattel slavery of classical Greece and Rome. But compared to most contemporary civilizations, the Gupta Empire represented a remarkable achievement in governance, culture, and intellectual life. It demonstrated that a large, diverse population could live under a framework of law and shared culture, that trade and cultural exchange could create prosperity, and that human creativity, properly supported and encouraged, could push the boundaries of knowledge and beauty. Yet, even at this peak, even as Kalidasa recited his verses and Aryabhata calculated the movements of planets, forces were gathering that would test every strength of the Gupta system and expose vulnerabilities that would prove fatal. The same decentralization that had allowed local adaptation would fracture the empire when unity was most needed. The same trade networks that brought prosperity would transmit economic shocks. The same cultural confidence that had fueled achievement would blind the empire to existential threats. The fall of the Gupta Empire would not be a simple story of decline, but a complex interplay of internal weaknesses and external pressures, of human decisions and impersonal forces, of contingency and structural inevitability. To understand how the empire fell, we must understand how the mechanisms that enabled its rise contained the seeds of its destruction. The genius of the Gupta political system, its decentralized federalism, was also its fundamental vulnerability. This system worked beautifully when the center was strong, when the emperor commanded personal loyalty and respect, when the benefits of participation in the imperial system clearly outweighed the costs. But it depended on informal bonds, on personal relationships between the emperor and his feudatories, on shared interests and mutual benefit rather than coercive force. It was, in essence, a system built on confidence, and confidence, once shaken, can be difficult to restore. When Chandragupta II died in 415 CE, he was succeeded by his son Kumaragupta I. By all accounts, Kumaragupta was a capable ruler who maintained the empire's prosperity and cultural vitality for 4 decades. But maintaining is not the same as building. The first generation of a dynasty or system often possesses a hunger, an energy, a willingness to take risks and break conventions that creates something new. The second generation, having inherited rather than created power, tends toward consolidation, toward preserving what exists rather than expanding it. And Kumaragupta faced challenges that his father had not. The first signs of stress appeared in the relationship between the center and the periphery. The feudatory system had always involved a delicate balance. Local rulers wanted autonomy but also needed the legitimacy and protection that came from imperial recognition. The emperor wanted their tribute and military support but couldn't afford to alienate them through excessive demands. Under Chandragupta II, this balance had been maintained through a combination of personal charisma, military success, and the clear benefits that the imperial system provided. But Kumaragupta did not inherit his father's reputation. He had to prove himself, and the feudatories, ever sensitive to shifts in the balance of power, watched carefully to see how much authority he could actually command. The Samantas began, gradually and carefully, to test the boundaries of their autonomy. They delayed sending tribute, claiming local difficulties, or questioning the assessment. They dragged their feet when called upon to provide military levies, citing needs for local defense. They began to keep a larger share of the tax revenues from their territories, developing justifications about increased administrative costs or necessary investments in local infrastructure. None of these actions, taken individually, represented open rebellion. Each could be explained, negotiated, managed, but collectively they represented a shift in the balance of power. A quiet assertion that the feudatories' interests came first and imperial demands second. Understanding this dynamic requires examining the incentive structures that shaped elite behavior. For a feudatory in a distant province, the benefits of full participation in the imperial system were often abstract and delayed, while the costs were immediate and concrete. Contributing troops to an imperial campaign meant depleting local defenses and risking those troops in battles that might not directly benefit the feudatories' interests. Sending revenue to the imperial treasury meant having less to invest in local infrastructure, to reward local supporters, or to build up military capacity for dealing with local rivals. The benefits of the imperial system: protection from external threats, access to trade networks, legitimacy conferred by imperial recognition, were diffuse and easy to take for granted, especially when the empire had been stable for generations. From the emperor's perspective, managing these dynamics became increasingly difficult without the personal authority and military reputation that had allowed earlier rulers to command genuine loyalty. Kumaragupta could threaten recalcitrant feudatories, but credible threats required the willingness and ability to enforce them militarily. Military campaigns against rebellious feudatories were expensive, risky, and could backfire by encouraging other feudatories to defect or by creating vacuums of power that invited external intervention. The emperor faced what game theorists would call a commitment problem. He needed to demonstrate that he would punish defection to deter others from defecting. But the costs of actually carrying out punishment could be so high as to make the threat incredible. This situation led to a pattern of escalating demands and declining compliance that characterized many failing empires throughout history. The emperor, facing declining revenues from non-compliant feudatories, increased the nominal demands on those who were still complying, hoping to make up the shortfall. But this increased the burden on the compliant feudatories, giving them reason to join the ranks of the non-compliant. Meanwhile, feudatories, who successfully resisted imperial demands, demonstrated that resistance was possible and perhaps even advantageous, encouraging others to test their own autonomy. The competition among feudatories themselves added another layer of complexity. In a stable imperial system, ambitious feudatories could compete for imperial favor, seeking advancement within the system through loyal service. But as central authority weakened, the path to power increasingly ran through local dominance rather than imperial service. Feudatories began competing with their neighbors for territory, for control of trade routes, for the allegiance of subordinate lords. These local conflicts absorbed resources that might otherwise have been available for imperial service and created a fragmented political landscape where each feudatory was more concerned with immediate neighbors than with distant imperial interests or external threats to the empire as a whole. This was a principal-agent problem playing out on a civilizational scale. The emperor, the principal, needed his feudatory agents to act in the empire's interest. But the feudatories had their own interests, their own concerns, their own local pressures and opportunities, and the farther they were from the imperial court, the easier it became to prioritize their interests over the empire's. The mechanisms of control that the emperor possessed were limited. He could threaten to revoke a feudatory status, but doing so risked driving that feudatory into open rebellion and encouraging others to defect as well. He could attempt to impose central control by replacing local dynasties with imperial governors, but this required military force and administrative capacity that the empire increasingly lacked. He could try to bind feudatories more closely through marriage alliances, but these took time to develop and could never cover all the territories under nominal Gupta control. Economic pressures compounded these political strains. The trade routes that had brought such prosperity to the empire were becoming less secure and less profitable. To the northwest, instability in Central Asia disrupted the overland routes that connected India to Persia and the Mediterranean. Nomadic groups, displaced by climate change and pressure from other peoples, were on the move, raiding merchant caravans and making travel dangerous. The maritime routes, too, faced increasing piracy. As central authority weakened, local rulers proved less willing or less able to protect merchants and suppress pirates. The result was a gradual constriction of trade, a reduction in the flow of goods, and, crucially, of the gold and silver that had funded the empire's prosperity. The Gupta response to this economic pressure revealed both the sophistication and the limitations of their statecraft. Faced with declining revenues, later Gupta emperors began to debase their coinage. They reduced the gold content of their dinars, replacing it with copper or silver. In the short term, this allowed the imperial treasury to continue functioning, to pay soldiers and officials, to maintain some level of expenditure. But it came at a cost. The confidence that had made Gupta coinage valuable throughout the ancient world began to erode. Merchants increasingly discounted Gupta coins or refused them entirely in long-distance trade. The monetary system, which had served as both a practical tool for commerce and a symbol of imperial authority, became a source of instability and a sign of weakness. We see here a pattern that would repeat throughout history, from the Roman Empire's 3rd century crisis to the collapse of the Ming dynasty in China. When states face fiscal stress, they often resort to monetary manipulation as a seemingly easy solution. But this solution only works in the short term and at the cost of long-term credibility. Once confidence in the currency is lost, the economic consequences can be devastating, and restoring that confidence is far more difficult than maintaining it in the first place. The military system underwent a similar erosion. The early Gupta emperors had maintained a professional standing army, loyal to the dynasty and capable of being deployed wherever needed. This army represented a significant expense, requiring regular pay, equipment, and training, but it provided flexibility and reliability that feudal levies could not match. As fiscal pressures mounted and central authority weakened, the standing army shrank. The burden of defense increasingly fell on feudal levies, local troops provided by the Samantas when the emperor requested them. These forces had several disadvantages. They were trained and equipped according to local standards, which varied widely. Their loyalty was to their local lords, not to the emperor. They could not be kept in the field indefinitely without straining local resources, and they were most effective when defending their home territories, least effective when deployed far from home. This military transition reflected a broader shift from centralized to decentralized power. In theory, a feudal military system could be just as effective as a professional army if the feudatories coordinated their efforts and subordinated their interests to imperial strategy. But this required exactly the kind of central authority and mutual trust that was eroding. Without strong coordination from the center, feudal armies tended to focus on local threats and local opportunities rather than empire-wide strategy. Each feudatory calculated whether committing forces to imperial campaigns served their interests, and increasingly the calculation came up negative. Religious and cultural life also showed signs of strain, though in more subtle ways. The Hindu revival that the Guptas had championed began to take forms that were less flexible and more exclusionary. Brahmanical orthodoxy, the authority of the priestly class and their traditional practices, became more emphasized. This served political purposes, reinforcing the legitimacy of rulers who claimed divine sanction and establishing clearer hierarchies in a period of uncertainty. But it also reduced the space for the kind of intellectual experimentation and religious pluralism that had characterized the empire's peak. Buddhist institutions, while not actively persecuted, received less patronage from the imperial court. Some monasteries found their land grants revoked, or their access to wealthy donors restricted. The intellectual vibrancy that came from the interaction between different religious and philosophical traditions began to diminish. The hardening of caste boundaries represented a similar dynamic. In times of prosperity and confidence, social boundaries tend to be more permeable. Successful merchants can gain recognition that approaches that of the warrior aristocracy. Talented individuals can move between occupations. But in times of stress and uncertainty, societies often respond by rigidifying categories, by emphasizing birth over achievement, by creating clearer distinctions between insiders and outsiders. The Gupta period saw the beginning of a process that would culminate in the highly stratified caste system of later medieval India. This rigidification served certain interests, allowing established elites to protect their positions and providing a sense of order and predictability in uncertain times. But it came at the cost of social mobility and dynamism, of the sense that talent and effort could be rewarded regardless of birth. These internal developments, the political fragmentation, the economic stress, the military weakening, the social rigidification, unfolded gradually over decades. No single year marked a decisive break. To those living through it, the changes might have seemed like minor adjustments, temporary setbacks that could be reversed when conditions improved. But systems have their own logic, their own momentum. Once confidence begins to erode, once the feedback loops that sustained success begin to reverse, arresting the decline becomes progressively more difficult. The very acts that seem rational for individual actors, the feudatories keeping more resources for themselves, the merchants hoarding sound currency, the elites restricting access to their class, collectively undermine the system that all depend upon. This dynamic points to one of the fundamental paradoxes of civilization: the structures and institutions that enable large-scale cooperation, that allow thousands or millions of people to coordinate their activities toward common goals, depend on collective goods like trust, legitimacy, and shared identity. But maintaining these collective goods requires individuals and groups to sometimes act against their immediate interests for the benefit of the whole. When the mechanisms that align individual and collective interests break down, when cooperation no longer seems reliably rewarded and defection offers immediate benefits, the system can enter a downward spiral where rational individual decisions produce collectively irrational outcomes. The Gupta Empire in the mid-5th century had not yet entered terminal decline. The infrastructure, both physical and institutional, built during the Golden Age, still functioned. The cultural prestige of the empire remained high. Kumaragupta still commanded respect, if not the awe that his grandfather had inspired. But the empire had lost its margin for error. It had become brittle, vulnerable to shocks that it would once have absorbed without great difficulty. And on the northwestern frontier, beyond the mountains and the passes that connected India to Central Asia, forces were gathering that would test the empire's resilience beyond its limits. The stage was set for a catastrophe. In the late 440s, reports began reaching the Gupta court of a new power emerging in Central Asia. Merchants who traveled the overland routes, soldiers stationed at frontier posts, and diplomats returning from missions beyond the empire's borders brought accounts of a nomadic confederation, the Hunas, who were sweeping across the steppes, displacing established peoples and disrupting the established order. At first, these reports seemed to describe events happening far away, problems for Persia, perhaps, but not immediate threats to India. The mountain ranges that separated India from Central Asia had always provided a measure of protection, funneling invasions through a few passable routes that could be defended. The Guptas had dealt with nomadic raiders before. There was no reason to think that this time would be different. But the Hunas, also known as the Hephthalites or White Huns, were different. They were not a simple raiding party seeking plunder before melting back into the steppes. They were a sophisticated political and military organization, capable of sustained campaigns, of siege warfare, of administering conquered territories. Their origins remain somewhat obscure, lost in the fragmentary records and shifting alliances of Central Asian politics. They emerged from the complex of Turkic and Iranian peoples who inhabited the steppes and oases north of the Hindu Kush mountains. Pressure from groups farther east, possibly connected to the great migrations that were simultaneously reshaping China and threatening Persia, set the Hunas in motion toward wealthier, more settled regions to the south. Around 455 CE, during the final years of Kumaragupta's reign, the first Huna raids struck the northwestern frontiers of the Gupta Empire. These initial attacks followed a pattern familiar from earlier nomadic incursions: swift cavalry forces crossing the mountain passes, raiding settled territories for plunder and slaves, then withdrawing before imperial forces could respond. But the scale and intensity of these raids exceeded anything in recent memory. The Hunas brought not just warriors but entire populations on the move, seeking new lands to settle, not just wealth to extract. Kumaragupta's son and successor, Skandagupta, faced the full weight of the Huna threat when he took the throne in 455. By all accounts, Skandagupta was a capable military commander and a determined ruler. He understood the gravity of the threat and mobilized the empire's resources for defense. In a series of campaigns over the next decade, he managed to check the Huna advance, stabilizing the frontier and even pushing them back beyond the mountain passes. Imperial inscriptions from his reign celebrate these victories in grandiose terms, comparing Skandagupta to the great heroes of Hindu mythology. But these victories came at enormous cost. Skandagupta had to drain the treasury to pay and equip the armies needed to fight the Hunas. He had to pressure the feudatories to provide larger levies and more resources than they had contributed in generations. The constant warfare devastated the northwestern provinces, disrupting agriculture and trade. And the feudatories, already inclined toward independence, resented the demands placed upon them. Some dragged their feet in providing support. Others questioned whether defending distant frontiers served their interests when their own territories faced no immediate threat. Skandagupta's reign represents one of history's bitter ironies. He was, by most measures, a successful ruler who achieved his primary objective of defending the empire. Yet his very success contained the seeds of future disaster. The resources expended in fighting the Hunas weakened the empire's overall capacity. The pressure placed on the feudatories accelerated their drift toward independence. And the Hunas, though checked, were not destroyed. They regrouped beyond the mountains, learned from their defeats, and prepared for renewed assaults. The nature of Skandagupta's military campaigns reveals both the capabilities and limitations of the Gupta military system. Ancient accounts, though fragmentary and often propagandistic, suggest that he fought multiple campaigns over more than a decade, repeatedly pushing Huna forces back across the mountain passes. These were not quick, decisive battles, but grinding wars of attrition. The Gupta armies had to march hundreds of miles to reach the frontier, traverse difficult mountain terrain, and then engage with a highly mobile enemy that could retreat into territories where supply and logistics became nightmarish for the pursuing forces. The economic cost of these campaigns was staggering. An army of tens of thousands of soldiers required not just pay but food, equipment, animals, and replacement supplies over campaigns that could last months. The logistics of moving such forces over long distances in an era before mechanized transport meant that substantial portions of the army's effort went simply to feeding and maintaining itself. Local populations along the line of march had to provide supplies, either through requisition or purchase, straining agricultural resources and creating resentment. The frontier regions, already suffering from Huna raids, now bore the additional burden of supporting extended military operations. Skandagupta financed these campaigns through extraordinary measures that provided short-term resources at long-term cost. He increased tax demands on feudatories and on productive regions still under secure control. He further debased the coinage, reducing gold and silver content to stretch precious metal reserves. He may have seized assets from wealthy individuals or institutions, though evidence for this is less clear. What is certain is that by the end of his reign, the imperial treasury was depleted, and the mechanisms for generating revenue were significantly weakened. The feudatories, who contributed troops and resources to these campaigns, did so with increasing reluctance and expectation of future autonomy. They had borne real costs in service of imperial defense, and they remembered these sacrifices when later emperors made demands. In some cases, feudatories who had distinguished themselves in the wars against the Hunas used their enhanced military reputation and capability to increase their independence from central authority. The very act of mobilizing for imperial defense strengthened centrifugal forces within the empire. When Skandagupta died around 467 CE, the succession was disputed. Multiple claimants, supported by different factions at court and different regional power bases, competed for the throne. This succession crisis, brief though it was, sent a signal to both the feudatories and external enemies. The empire was vulnerable, its unity no longer assured. The careful balance that had held the system together was breaking down. The renewed Huna invasions, beginning around 480 CE, under their leaders Toramana and his son Mihirakula, faced a very different Gupta Empire than Skandagupta had commanded. The central government was weaker, its treasury depleted, Its ability to coordinate responses across vast territories diminished. The feudatories were more independent, more focused on their own survival and interests. The economic infrastructure that had supported military mobilization was damaged from decades of warfare and disrupted trade. The Hunas, meanwhile, had learned from their earlier defeats. They developed more sophisticated tactics for dealing with fortified cities and sedentary armies. They forged alliances with some regional rulers who saw opportunity in the empire's weakness. The invasion quickly took on the character not just of border raids, but of conquest and settlement. The Hunas seized and held territory, establishing their own authority in the northwestern provinces. The great city of Taxila, once a center of Buddhist learning and a node in the trade network connecting India to Central Asia, fell to Huna forces. Other cities followed. Some were sacked, their populations killed or enslaved, their wealth looted. Others surrendered and accepted Huna overlordship. The wave of destruction and displacement sent refugees fleeing into the still secure portions of the empire, straining resources and spreading panic. The psychological impact of these defeats was as significant as the material damage. The Gupta Empire had not known defeat on this scale within living memory. The emperor's ability to protect his subjects, a fundamental basis of legitimate authority, was called into question. Religious explanations for the disaster proliferated. Some saw it as divine punishment for moral failures, a karmic consequence of accumulated sins. Others interpreted it as the inevitable decline predicted in Hindu cyclical theories of time, the end of one age and the beginning of a darker one. These religious frameworks provided meaning to catastrophe, but they also undermined confidence in the possibility of recovery. If the disaster was divinely ordained or cosmically inevitable, what hope was there in resistance? The military challenge posed by the Hunas exposed fundamental limitations in the Gupta military system. The Huna forces were built around light cavalry, mounted archers who could cover vast distances quickly, who could attack and retreat before slower infantry armies could respond. This nomadic military model had evolved over centuries of warfare on the Central Asian steppes. It was superbly adapted for raiding, for disrupting enemy logistics, for forcing battles only when conditions were favorable. Against it, the Gupta armies, a mix of infantry, elephants, and heavier cavalry, found themselves consistently outmaneuvered. They could hold fortified positions but could not catch the Huna forces in open terrain. They could not prevent the Hunas from disrupting agriculture and trade, from isolating and besieging cities, from fragmenting imperial territory. The geographic vulnerabilities of the northwestern frontier became painfully apparent. The passes through the mountains, the same passes that had historically protected India from the full force of Central Asian turbulence, now served as entry points for a persistent and capable enemy. Unlike earlier raiders who withdrew after collecting plunder, the Hunas established bases in the mountain valleys, from which they could launch repeated campaigns into the plains. The open terrain of the Punjab and the upper Indus Valley favored cavalry warfare and made defense exceptionally difficult. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of the Huna invasions was the coordination failure among the Gupta feudatories. In theory, the empire's decentralized system should have been resilient, with each region capable of self-defense. In practice, the fragmentation that had been developing for decades meant that feudatories failed to coordinate their responses. Each regional ruler calculated whether committing forces to fight the Hunas served his immediate interests. Those far from the frontier reasoned that the threat was distant and that the northwestern territories should bear the burden of their own defense. Those on the frontier found themselves fighting alone, without the support they had expected from the imperial system. This was a classic freerider problem, playing out in real time with catastrophic consequences. The defense of the empire was a collective good that benefited all feudatories, but it required collective action and individual sacrifice. Each feudatory faced an incentive to let others bear the costs of defense while enjoying the benefits if the Hunas were repulsed. But when all reasoned this way, none contributed sufficient resources, and the collective defense collapsed. Some feudatories even calculated that they might benefit from the empire's troubles by expanding their own territories at the expense of weakened neighbors, or by negotiating separate arrangements with the Hunas. The economic consequences of the invasion cascaded through the entire system. The northwestern trade routes, already stressed, now essentially collapsed. The land routes to Central Asia and Persia became too dangerous for merchant caravans. The revenues that had flowed from trade taxes disappeared. The cities that had grown wealthy from this commerce contracted or were abandoned. The disruption of agriculture in the war zones created food shortages and price spikes in other regions. The imperial treasury, already strained, lost major sources of revenue precisely when military expenditures were highest. As revenue declined, the debasement of coinage accelerated. Copper increasingly replaced precious metals in Gupta coins. The monetary system, which had been a source of stability and a symbol of imperial authority, became a source of instability and inflation. Merchants reverted to barter for major transactions. Credit, which lubricates commerce, dried up as confidence collapsed. The economic integration that had been one of the empire's great achievements unraveled. The social and cultural damage was equally severe, though it unfolded more gradually. Major Buddhist monasteries in the northwest, centers of learning that had attracted students from across Asia, were damaged or destroyed. The monastic libraries, collections of texts that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge, were lost to fire and neglect. The monks who survived scattered, carrying what they could to safer regions. The intellectual networks that had sustained Buddhist philosophical and scientific inquiry were disrupted. While Buddhism would survive and even flourish in other regions, particularly in the Himalayas and East Asia, the tradition in its Indian heartland never fully recovered. Hindu temples and institutions faced similar pressures. Without stable patronage from wealthy donors or royal courts, maintaining the complex infrastructure of major temples became difficult. The performance of elaborate rituals, which required expensive materials and many priests, was curtailed. The educational institutions associated with temples contracted. The production of Sanskrit literature declined sharply. The poets and scholars who had created the cultural glory of the Gupta Golden Age found fewer patrons and less secure conditions for their work. Urban populations, facing warfare, economic collapse, and epidemic disease, made individual decisions that collectively accelerated urban decline. Those who could flee to safer regions did so. Artisans, unable to find work in contracting markets, returned to agricultural subsistence. The services and infrastructure that defined urban life, the markets and temples, the sanitation and security, degraded from lack of maintenance and resources. Archaeological evidence from this period shows clear signs of urban contraction, cities shrinking within their walls, fine structures being demolished for building materials, and areas that had been intensely occupied becoming much less densely settled. By the early 6th century, by around 520 CE, the Gupta Empire existed largely in name only. An emperor still sat in Pataliputra, still issued coins and inscriptions claiming authority over vast territories. But effective control extended only to the immediate vicinity of the capital. The northwestern provinces were lost to the Hunas. Regional kingdoms had emerged throughout the empire, ruled by dynasties that might still nominally acknowledge Gupta suzerainty, but acted as independent powers in all practical matters. A local ruler, named Yasodharman, based in Malwa in central India, managed to defeat the Huna leader Mihirakula around 528 CE, briefly raising hopes of imperial restoration. But Yasodharman could not or would not attempt to reunify the empire. He was content to establish his own regional kingdom, further fragmenting the political landscape. The end of effective Gupta rule is usually dated to around 550 CE, though the process was gradual enough that no single date can capture it. The last Gupta rulers controlled an area no larger than a middling regional kingdom, and even that control was contested. The great experiment in decentralized empire, in balancing local autonomy with broader unity, had failed. The Huna invasions had been the catalyst, the external shock that exposed and accelerated internal weaknesses. But the collapse was not simply the result of military defeat. It was the result of a complex interplay between external pressure and internal fragmentation, between immediate crises and long-developing structural problems, between human decisions and impersonal forces. Yet the most profound damage was still to come. The invasions had devastated the northwest and weakened central authority, but the empire had survived invasions before. What made the Gupta collapse so complete, so difficult to reverse, was what happened next, a cascading system failure in which the breakdown of one domain triggered breakdowns in others, creating a downward spiral that no single intervention could arrest. The invasions had opened the wound. The systemic collapse would ensure it never healed. When we think about collapse, we often imagine a single decisive event, a lost battle, a conquered capital, a dynasty overthrown. The reality is usually more complex and more insidious. The fall of the Gupta Empire was not a single catastrophe, but a cascade of interconnected failures, each feeding into and amplifying the others, creating a downward spiral that eventually reached a point where recovery became impossible. Understanding this cascade reveals something fundamental about how complex human systems function and fail, lessons that resonate far beyond ancient India. The economic dimension of the collapse was both cause and consequence of the broader disintegration. The trade networks that had sustained Gupta prosperity depended on predictability, security, and trust. Merchants needed to know that their goods would reach their destinations, that contracts would be enforced, that the coins they accepted would hold their value. As the empire fragmented and warfare intensified, each of these conditions eroded. The great trade routes that had connected India to Central Asia, to the Persian Gulf, to Southeast Asia, had never been entirely secure. They had always required active maintenance, protection against bandits and pirates, diplomatic relations with powers along the routes, and infrastructure like caravanserais and harbor facilities. In the Gupta Golden Age, the imperial government and wealthy merchants had cooperated to provide these services. But as central authority weakened and revenues declined, this cooperation broke down. Roads fell into disrepair. Bandits operated with impunity in regions where no local authority was strong enough to suppress them. Pirates infested the sea lanes. The diplomatic relationships that had smoothed passage through foreign territories lapsed. The result was a contraction of long-distance trade. The most profitable routes, those that connected India to distant markets, were the first to become uneconomical. Merchants faced a calculation: the potential profit from a successful journey versus the risk of loss from robbery, shipwreck, or confiscation by local authorities. As risk increased and profit margins shrank, fewer merchants attempted the longest journeys. Trade became increasingly localized, confined to shorter routes within regions where conditions were more predictable. The mechanism of this contraction followed rational economic logic, even as it produced collectively irrational outcomes. Each merchant who decided that a particular route was too dangerous to travel was making a reasonable individual decision. But collectively, these decisions meant that the trade routes became less traveled, which in turn meant less traffic to support the infrastructure of trade, fewer caravanserais and port facilities, fewer established relationships between merchants and local authorities. This created a downward spiral where reduced trade led to deteriorating conditions, which led to further reductions in trade. Moreover, the contraction of long-distance trade disproportionately affected the most specialized and valuable goods. Bulk commodities like grain might still be transported over modest distances where the risk-reward calculation remained favorable. But luxury goods, spices, fine textiles, precious metals, the high-value items that had generated the largest profits and funded the most sophisticated commercial enterprises, were exactly the goods that bandits most wanted to seize and that were most sensitive to political instability. The loss of this high-value trade meant that the most successful merchants, those with the most capital and the most extensive networks, faced the greatest losses, further destabilizing the commercial system. This trade contraction had multiplying effects throughout the economy. Cities that had grown wealthy as intrepids for long-distance trade lost their reason for existence. Artisans who had produced goods for export found their markets vanishing. The specialization that creates economic efficiency became impossible when markets shrank. A craftsman who had made fine metalwork for the export trade, commanding high prices and supporting a family in comfort, might find himself unable to survive when that market collapsed and he had to compete with local smiths for local customers. Skills were lost as masters could not support apprentices, as specialized workshops closed, as knowledge that had been valuable became worthless. Consider the situation of a master bronze worker in a major city who had spent decades perfecting techniques for creating elaborate decorative vessels that were exported to Persian and Roman markets. His workshop might have employed a dozen apprentices and assistants, producing pieces that sold for prices that reflected their artistry and the exotic markets they served. As export trade contracted, the demand for such luxury items collapsed. The bronze worker might attempt to adapt, producing simpler goods for local markets at much lower prices, but he now competed with many other craftsmen, some with lower overhead and different specializations, all trying to survive in a shrunken market. Unable to maintain his workshop at previous scales, he might have to dismiss assistants and stop taking apprentices. When he eventually died, his particular techniques and accumulated knowledge might die with him, lost for lack of anyone to transmit them to. This pattern, repeated across hundreds of crafts and thousands of workshops, represented an enormous destruction of human capital. Skills that had taken generations to develop Techniques that had been refined through centuries of practice. Specialized knowledge that had made Gupta products valued across the ancient world, all were at risk. Some knowledge survived, transmitted through texts, or through the handful of craftsmen who managed to continue their work in reduced circumstances. But much was simply lost, part of the invisible but profound cost of economic collapse. Urban decline followed inevitably from the trade collapse. Cities in the ancient world were not self-sufficient. They depended on the surplus from agriculture to feed their populations, and they justified their consumption of that surplus through the services they provided: markets, protection, administration, religious institutions, and cultural amenities. But as trade declined and wealth contracted, the agricultural surplus available to support cities also declined. Farmers, facing their own difficulties, were less able or less willing to provide food for urban populations that offered them less in return. Archaeological evidence paints a stark picture. Excavations of Guptara cities show a pattern of decline. The abandonment of outlying areas within city walls, the demolition of stone buildings for materials to repair others. The accumulation of debris in streets that were no longer maintained, and eventually the complete abandonment of sites that had been thriving urban centers during the empire's height. Some cities survived in reduced form, their populations a fraction of what they had been. Others were simply abandoned, their residents dispersing to villages or other towns that seemed to offer better prospects. The monetary system, already weakened by debasement during the crisis years, essentially collapsed in many regions. The Gupta coinage had been a sophisticated system with gold dinars for large transactions, silver coins for middling trade, and copper for everyday use. But as the gold and silver content of coins declined, merchants and consumers lost confidence in them. A gold coin that was actually mostly copper might still trade at face value in transactions with the imperial government or with merchants who had no choice but to accept it. But in voluntary exchanges, people discounted it or refused it entirely. The result was Gresham's law in action: bad money driving out good. Sound coins were hoarded or melted down for their metal content. Debased coins circulated, but with continually declining purchasing power. In some regions, coined money essentially disappeared from circulation, replaced by barter or by commodity money like grain or textiles. This represented a profound regression in economic sophistication. Barter is vastly less efficient than monetary exchange. It requires a double coincidence of wants. I must have what you want, and you must have what I want, and we must agree on the exchange rate. This severely limits the scope for trade and specialization. A monetary economy allows complex chains of exchange where I can sell my labor to one person, use the money to buy food from a second, clothing from a third, and tools from a fourth. A barter economy cannot support this level of complexity. The agricultural foundation of the economy also degraded, though this process was slower and more variable across regions. Intensive agriculture in the ancient world depended on irrigation systems that required coordinated maintenance. Dams and channels needed regular repair. Water allocation among different users required adjudication by some authority. In the Gupta period, these functions had been performed by a combination of village councils, temple institutions, and local rulers under the overall framework of imperial law. As that framework collapsed and local authorities became more autonomous and more focused on immediate survival, the collective action needed to maintain irrigation systems became harder to coordinate. the deterioration was gradual and uneven. In some regions, local institutions proved resilient, and agriculture continued to function reasonably well. In others, particularly in areas most affected by warfare and political fragmentation, the breakdown was severe. Fields that had been productive reverted to waste. Canals silted up. The agricultural surplus that had supported urban populations and funded trade disappeared. The political dimension of the collapse was intimately connected to the economic decline. As revenues fell, rulers at every level faced impossible choices. They could try to extract more from their subjects through higher taxes, but this risked provoking resistance and further damaging an already struggling economy. They could reduce expenditures, but this meant cutting the very services, military protection, infrastructure, maintenance, and administrative capacity that justified their authority. They could debase the coinage or seize the assets of wealthy subjects. But these measures provided only temporary relief while permanently undermining confidence and cooperation. Most rulers tried some combination of all these expedients with predictably poor results. The decline of state capacity became self-reinforcing. As the government provided fewer services, subjects became less willing to pay taxes. As tax compliance fell, the government had fewer resources to enforce compliance or provide services. Regional power holders, who had been feudatories of the empire, increasingly acted as independent rulers, keeping local revenues for themselves rather than passing them up to any higher authority. The proliferation of regional kingdoms after the Gupta collapse represented not just political fragmentation, but a fundamental shift in the scale and nature of political organization. The successor kingdoms, dynasties like the Malkaras, the Matrakas, and the early Pushyabhutas, controlled much smaller territories than the Gupta Empire at its height. This smaller scale had both advantages and disadvantages. It allowed rulers to maintain more direct control, to respond more quickly to local conditions, and to build political legitimacy through personal relationships rather than impersonal institutions. But it also meant the loss of the benefits that imperial scale had provided: coordinated defense against external threats, economic integration across large territories, and the resources to support cultural and intellectual institutions. Some rulers attempted to recreate imperial authority on a smaller scale. The most notable was Harsha, who ruled from 606 to 647 CE and managed to unite much of northern India under his authority. But Harsha's empire was always more fragile than the Gupta Empire at its height. It depended heavily on his personal military success and administrative energy. It never developed the institutional depth or the genuine loyalty of feudatories that had characterized the Gupta system in its prime. When Harsha died without an heir, his empire immediately fragmented, demonstrating that he had created a personal dominion rather than a durable institutional structure. The phenomenon of feudalization, the transition from centralized imperial administration to a system where land and authority were granted in exchange for military service and personal loyalty, accelerated during this period. The practice of granting land to supporters, which had always existed in some form, became the dominant mechanism for organizing political and military power. These grants, originally temporary and conditional, became hereditary and permanent. A local strongman who received land in exchange for providing soldiers found that he could pass that land to his sons, who inherited both the estate and the obligation. This system, superficially similar to European feudalism several centuries later, represented an adaptation to conditions where centralized authority was weak and where local power holders had to be accommodated rather than commanded. But it locked in fragmentation. Each feudal grant represented authority delegated away from the center, revenue that would no longer flow to the central treasury, military power that answered to local rather than imperial interests. And once established, these arrangements proved extraordinarily difficult to reverse. A ruler who attempted to reclaim granted lands or reimpose central authority faced potential rebellion from entrenched local powers. The social and cultural dimensions of collapse were perhaps the most profound, though they unfolded over the longest time frame. The Brahmanical religious establishment, the priests and scholars who performed rituals and preserved sacred texts, responded to the crisis by emphasizing orthodoxy and ritual precision. This was partly a defensive reaction, a way of asserting control and maintaining authority when other forms of power were failing. But it also reflected genuine religious convictions that the catastrophes afflicting society resulted from failures to properly honor the gods and maintain cosmic order. The emphasis on ritual correctness and social hierarchy led to an intensification of caste distinctions. The boundaries between castes became more rigid, the rules governing interaction between castes more elaborate and more strictly enforced. This rigidification served various purposes. For Brahmin priests, for other upper castes, it protected their status in a period when economic decline threatened to blur distinctions based on wealth. For communities as a whole, it provided a framework of order and predictability when other forms of social organization were failing. But the intensification of caste boundaries came at significant costs. Social mobility, never easy in ancient India, but not impossible during prosperous periods, became much more difficult. The economic dynamism that comes from allowing talented individuals to move between occupations was sacrificed. The sense of shared identity and common purpose that had helped bind the empire together was replaced by a more fragmented social landscape where caste and local identities became paramount. Buddhist institutions, which had flourished under Gupta patronage, entered a period of decline in northern India. This was not a sudden persecution, but a gradual withering from loss of support. Wealthy donors increasingly directed their resources toward Hindu temples rather than Buddhist monasteries. Royal patronage shifted. The monasteries that survived often did so by becoming more localized, more focused on serving local communities rather than attracting students from across Asia. The great intellectual traditions of Buddhist philosophy and science continued in other regions, particularly in Tibet and East Asia, where Buddhism was expanding. But in its Indian heartland, the religion that had once been a major cultural force became increasingly marginalized. The intellectual consequences of the collapse were profound. The production of Sanskrit literature, which had reached extraordinary heights during the Gupta Golden Age, declined sharply. The courts that had patronized poets and playwrights were gone or impoverished. The audiences for sophisticated literary work, urban elites with education and leisure, had contracted. Some literary production continued in the courts of regional rulers, but the scale and ambition were much reduced. More concerning, specialized knowledge that required institutional support and master-prentice transmission began to be lost. The mathematical and astronomical traditions that had been so advanced under the Guptas did not disappear entirely, but they lost their earlier dynamism. The institutions that had supported sustained inquiry, that had allowed scholars to build on each other's work across generations were weakened or destroyed. Some texts survived, copied and preserved in monasteries and temple libraries. Some knowledge was transmitted through individual teachers to dedicated students. But the systematic, cumulative progress that had characterized the Golden Age largely ceased. We can understand the intellectual impact through the lens of what economists call human capital and what sociologists call institutional knowledge. Highly specialized skills, advanced mathematics, sophisticated metallurgy, complex architectural techniques require not just individual genius but systems of education and apprenticeship. A talented individual might reinvent basic principles, but pushing the boundaries of knowledge requires building on the accumulated work of previous generations. When institutions collapse and patronage disappears, this transmission breaks down. The loss is not immediate or total, but it is real and difficult to reverse. The psychological impact of collapse on ordinary people is harder to document, but no less important. The world that had seemed stable and predictable dissolved into uncertainty and danger. People who had planned for the future, who had invested in trade or craft skills or education, found their investments worthless. Communities were scattered by warfare and economic disruption. The social networks that had provided support and opportunity were broken. Traditional authorities, whether imperial officials or local notables, proved unable to protect or provide for their communities. Human responses to this kind of comprehensive uncertainty follow predictable patterns. People retreat into smaller, more immediate circles of trust, typically family and close neighbors. They shift from longer-term to shorter-term thinking, from investment to consumption. They seek explanations for the catastrophe, often in religious or moral terms. They develop nostalgia for a lost past that becomes progressively more idealized as memory fades and reality disappoints. All of these responses are individually rational, but collectively they make recovery more difficult. When no one trusts institutions, when everyone hoards rather than invests, when the past is idealized rather than built upon, rebuilding becomes enormously challenging. The localization of identity and loyalty was particularly significant. People who had once thought of themselves as subjects of the Gupta Empire, participants in a broader civilization, increasingly identified primarily with more immediate communities, their caste, their region, their village, their religious sect. This shift was both cause and consequence of political fragmentation. As larger political structures failed to provide security and opportunity, smaller identities became more salient. But the strengthening of these smaller identities made rebuilding larger political structures more difficult. From a systems theory perspective, what we see in the Gupta collapse is a classic example of cascading failure in a complex system. Complex systems, whether empires or ecosystems or financial networks, typically exhibit interdependence among their components. The economic system depends on political stability. Political authority depends on economic resources. Both depend on social cohesion and shared identity. Cultural and intellectual life depend on patronage from economic and political elites. These interdependencies create resilience under normal circumstances. A shock to one component can be buffered by the others, but they also create vulnerability. If shocks are severe enough, or if multiple shocks occur simultaneously, the interdependencies can transmit failure throughout the system. To understand this more concretely, consider how a failure in military defense cascaded through other domains. The Huna invasions disrupted trade routes, destroying caravans and making travel dangerous. This reduced trade revenues, which meant less tax income for the state. Reduced state revenues meant less capacity to pay and equip military forces, which made defense less effective. Weakened defense invited further invasions and banditry, which further disrupted trade. Each turn of this cycle made the next turn worse, creating what system theorists call a positive feedback loop. Positive, not in the sense of good, but in the sense of self-reinforcing. Similarly, the political fragmentation created its own feedback loop. As feudatories asserted greater autonomy, the emperor's ability to coordinate collective defense weakened. Weaker collective defense meant that feudatories felt more vulnerable and needed to invest more in local military capacity. But building local military capacity required keeping more resources locally, which meant sending less tribute to the center. This further weakened the center's coordinating capacity, encouraging more feudatory independence. Again, each step made the next step more likely and more severe. The social and cultural domain showed similar dynamics. As patronage for learning declined, fewer young people pursued advanced education. Fewer educated individuals meant less transmission of specialized knowledge. Loss of knowledge meant less capability for the sophisticated administration and cultural production that had characterized the Golden Age. This made the society less attractive to talented individuals who might migrate to regions with better opportunities, further depleting the human capital base. These feedback loops did not operate in isolation, but interacted with each other in complex ways. Economic decline reduced the resources available for education, which reduced human capital, which made economic recovery more difficult. Political fragmentation disrupted trade, which reduced the economic resources available to maintain political institutions, which encouraged further fragmentation. Social disorder undermined trust, which made economic coordination more difficult, and political cooperation less likely, which increased social disorder. What makes such cascading failures particularly dangerous is that they can reach tipping points beyond which recovery becomes extremely difficult or impossible. A trade route that loses too much traffic may fall below the threshold needed to maintain the restructure that makes trade viable, at which point the route may collapse entirely rather than simply decline. A political institution that loses too much legitimacy may not be able to command the compliance necessary to function, at which point it fails completely rather than merely weakening. A cultural tradition that fails to transmit itself to a sufficient number of new practitioners may simply die out rather than continue in reduced form. The Gupta Empire appears to have crossed several such tipping points in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. The trade network didn't just shrink, but in many cases collapsed entirely, with formerly busy routes abandoned. Political unity didn't just weaken but dissolved into warring fragments. Cultural institutions didn't just decline, but in some cases disappeared completely, their knowledge lost. Once these tipping points were crossed, the path back became extraordinarily difficult, requiring not just the reversal of the immediate problems, but the reconstruction of the entire system of interdependent components. This is precisely what happened to the Gupta Empire. The Huna invasions created military and political shocks. These disrupted trade and damaged the economic system. Economic decline reduced state capacity, which weakened military defense and political authority. Social disorder and elite competition undermined cooperation and trust. Cultural and intellectual institutions lost patronage and fell into decline. Each of these problems fed back into the others, creating what system theorists call a positive feedback loop. Not positive in the sense of good, but positive in the sense of self-reinforcing. Decline bred more decline. Systems in this kind of downward spiral can sometimes be stabilized if external conditions improve, or if heroic efforts by capable leaders can break the feedback loops. Skandagupta's temporary success against the Hunas showed this possibility. Harsh's brief reunification demonstrated it again. But without addressing the underlying structural problems, the fragmentation, the loss of collective identity and purpose, the weakening of institutions, such stabilization proves temporary. The system remains brittle, vulnerable to the next shock. The comparison with other historical collapses is illuminating. The fall of the Western Roman Empire followed a similar pattern of cascading failure over several centuries. External pressures from Germanic migrations, internal political fragmentation, economic contraction, and social transformation reinforced each other until the imperial structure simply dissolved. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE saw multiple civilizations in the eastern Mediterranean simultaneously fail, likely due to a combination of climate change, economic disruption, and military conflict that overwhelmed systems that had become too interdependent and too specialized. Closer to the Gupta collapse in both time and space, the Tang dynasty in China experienced its own crisis in the 8th century, triggered by the An-Lushan rebellion. The Tang recovered, but in weakened form, and eventually fell in the early 10th century. The Abbasid Caliphate, contemporary with the later Gupta period, followed a similar trajectory of golden age, followed by fragmentation and decline. These parallel developments suggest that something about the structure of large agrarian empires in the pre-modern world made them vulnerable to this pattern of cascading failure. Modern examples offer cautionary parallels. The dissolution of the Soviet Union involved similar dynamics: economic dysfunction, loss of central authority, fragmentation along ethnic and regional lines, and the unraveling of institutions. The collapse of state authority in Syria after 2011 demonstrated how quickly a modern state, despite having technology and resources far beyond ancient empires, can fragment when political, economic, and social pressures combine. These examples remind us that the patterns visible in ancient history are not merely of antiquarian interest. They reveal something fundamental about how human systems function and fail. Yet the very concept of collapse requires careful examination. When we say that the Gupta Empire collapsed, what exactly do we mean? The political structure dissolved, certainly. Imperial authority ceased to be effective, but people continued to live in the former Gupta territories. They farmed, they traded, they worshipped, they married, and raised children. Some cultural traditions adapted and survived. Regional kingdoms emerged that, while smaller than the empire, provided some measure of order and governance. Was this collapse or transformation? The question matters because it shapes how we understand both the past and the possibilities for our own future. If collapse means the end of everything, it is utterly catastrophic. If it means dramatic change and adaptation, it is still traumatic, but not necessarily terminal. The answer, unsatisfyingly, is that collapse is both, for those who depended on imperial institutions, for the urban elites, for the scholars and merchants and artisans whose livelihoods depended on the broader system. The Gupta collapse was genuinely catastrophic. Skills were lost, wealth was destroyed, opportunities vanished. But for many peasants, for people living in villages and working the land, life continued in forms that were not radically different. They had always lived at some distance from imperial authority. They adapted to new overlords, to changed economic conditions, to religious and social shifts. Life was harder and more uncertain, but it went on. This unevenness of collapse, the fact that some people and some regions experienced it as total catastrophe, while others experienced it as painful but survivable change, is itself an important observation. It reminds us that civilizational collapse is not a uniform event, but a process that affects different people and places in different ways and at different speeds. It also suggests that the narrative of collapse, however accurate for certain domains, can obscure the continuities and adaptations that also characterize such periods. Yet even as we recognize these nuances, the reality remains that something profound was lost in the Gupta collapse. A level of political organization, economic integration, and cultural achievement that would not be matched in the Indian subcontinent for many centuries had vanished. The question that haunted survivors, and that should interest us, is whether that loss was inevitable, whether different decisions at critical moments might have changed the outcome, and what, if anything, endures when empires fall. In the centuries after the Gupta collapse, after the invasions had subsided, and the immediate chaos had passed, the people of India faced a profoundly altered world. The political map had been redrawn, not once, but continuously, as regional kingdoms rose and fell, expanded and contracted, competed and sometimes cooperated. The economic landscape had shifted from the integration and long-distance trade of the imperial period to more localized patterns of production and exchange. The social and cultural order had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. Yet, amidst all this change, certain elements of the Gupta legacy persisted, adapted, and even flourished in unexpected ways. The immediate aftermath of the empire's fall saw a series of attempts to recreate imperial unity. The most successful was undertaken by Harsha, who ruled from 606 to 647 CE, starting as a minor prince in the Pushyabhuti dynasty. Harsha built an impressive domain through military conquest and diplomatic skill. At its height, his empire controlled much of northern India from Punjab to Bengal. Contemporary accounts describe a sophisticated court, patronage of Buddhist institutions, and efforts to restore some of the administrative structures that had existed under the Guptas. But Harsha's empire revealed the limits of what was possible in the post-Gupta world. Unlike the earlier empire, which had rested on a complex system of feudatory relationships backed by cultural unity and economic integration, Harsha's domain was held together primarily by his personal military success and administrative energy. He spent much of his reign on campaign, constantly moving to suppress rebellions, intimidate potential rivals, and demonstrate his power. The feudatories, who acknowledged his authority, did so because they feared his army or hoped for his patronage, not because they felt part of a broader imperial system. When Harsha died without an heir in 647 CE, his empire immediately disintegrated. The regional rulers who had submitted to him reasserted their independence. No one successfully claimed his mantle. The rapidity of this collapse demonstrated that Harsha had created a personal dominion rather than an institutional structure, a distinction that would prove crucial for understanding the possibilities of political organization in medieval India. The pattern that emerged over the following centuries was one of regional kingdoms, middling in size, constantly competing for dominance, but rarely achieving it. In the northwest, the Rajput clans established warrior kingdoms that would dominate the region for centuries. In the Deccan, dynasties like the Chalukyas built impressive states based on control of trade routes and agricultural resources. In the east, Bengal developed its own distinct political culture under various dynasties. These kingdoms were not simply fragments of the former empire. They developed their own institutions, their own political cultures, their own legitimating ideologies. The Buddhist institutions of northern India, which had been among the great intellectual centers of the ancient world, entered terminal decline, while Buddhism continued to flourish in Tibet, East Asia, and Southeast Asia, often building on traditions that had originated in India. The religion gradually disappeared from most of the Indian subcontinent itself. By the 12th century, when Muslim armies conquered northern India and destroyed the few remaining major Buddhist monasteries, Buddhism, in the land of its birth, was already a shadow of its former self. This represented not just the loss of a religion, but the loss of entire intellectual traditions, of texts and commentaries, of lineages of teaching and practice that had developed over more than a millennium. The social rigidification that occurred in the wake of the collapse, particularly the hardening of caste boundaries, arguably impoverished Indian society for centuries. The Golden Age had seen considerable social mobility, at least by the standards of pre-modern societies. Talented individuals from non-elite backgrounds could rise through government service, through commerce, or through religious institutions. The post-collapse period saw this mobility severely restricted. The social system became more hereditary, more focused on birth rather than achievement, more resistant to change. The economic and social dynamism that comes from allowing talent to find its outlet regardless of birth was sacrificed. These losses are difficult to quantify, but important to acknowledge. When we celebrate the resilience of culture and the survival of knowledge, we should also recognize what did not survive, what possibilities were foreclosed, what alternative trajectories were rendered impossible by the cascade of events that destroyed the Gupta Empire. The Gupta collapse offers several profound lessons about the nature of civilizational decline and the factors that determine whether societies can recover from catastrophic shocks. First, it demonstrates the tension between centralization and decentralization in governance. The Gupta system had tried to balance central authority with local autonomy, and for a time this balance worked brilliantly. But when tested by external shocks and internal pressures, the balance proved difficult to maintain. Centralization can provide coordination and mobilization of resources, but creates brittleness if the center fails. Decentralization provides flexibility and resilience, but makes collective action difficult. There is no perfect solution, only trade-offs that work better or worse, depending on circumstances. Second, the collapse illustrates how external shocks and internal vulnerabilities interact. The Huna invasions alone might not have destroyed the empire if it had been internally cohesive and well-governed. The internal fragmentation might have remained manageable if external threats had been modest. It was the combination, each amplifying the other, that proved fatal. This pattern recurs throughout history. Societies rarely collapse from a single cause. They fail when multiple stresses combine in ways that overwhelm their adaptive capacity. Third, the Gupta experience demonstrates the difference between cultural and political survival. The idea that civilizations fall and everything associated with them disappears is too simple. Political structures proved more fragile than cultural traditions. Institutions that required centralized resources and coordination collapsed, but those that could function through distributed networks adapted and persisted. This suggests that when we think about resilience and sustainability, we should consider not just the strength of central institutions, but the robustness of distributed networks and traditions. Fourth, the collapse reveals the importance of collective action and coordination. The failure of Gupta feudatories to mount a unified defense against the Hunas, despite it being in their collective interest, is a case study in the tragedy of the commons and the freerider problem. Individual rationality led to collective catastrophe. This pattern is not unique to ancient India. It appears whenever groups must cooperate to address common threats, but face incentives to prioritize individual interests. Climate change in the modern world presents a similar challenge on a global scale. Fifth, the cascading nature of the collapse highlights the importance of interdependencies in complex systems. The Gupta Empire was not a simple hierarchical structure, but a network of economic, political, social, and cultural relationships, each depending on the others. This interdependence created resilience under normal conditions, but vulnerability under stress. When one component failed, it triggered failures in others. Understanding these interdependencies and their potential failure modes is crucial for managing any complex system, whether an ancient empire or a modern economy. These lessons carry contemporary relevance that extends beyond academic interest. We live in a world of unprecedented complexity and interdependence. Global supply chains connect producers and consumers across continents. Financial systems integrate markets worldwide. Information networks link billions of people in real time. This integration brings enormous benefits in terms of efficiency, innovation, and wealth creation. But it also creates vulnerabilities. Shocks in one region can cascade globally. The failure of key nodes can disrupt entire networks. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated how quickly an interdependent world can face systematic disruptions. Climate change presents challenges that, in some ways, parallel those faced by ancient empires. Environmental stresses, increasing frequency of extreme weather, shifts in agricultural productivity, and displacement of populations can all weaken political institutions and strain social cohesion. Like the Gupta feudatories facing the Huna threat, nations today face collective action problems in addressing climate change. Individual incentives favor free-riding on others' efforts at mitigation. The benefits of cooperation are diffuse and long-term, while the costs are immediate and concentrated. The Gupta collapse serves as a warning about what can happen when collective action fails in the face of existential threats. The fragility of knowledge and institutions is another contemporary concern raised by the Gupta experience. We take for granted that scientific and technological knowledge will accumulate, that progress is linear and irreversible. The Gupta collapse reminds us that knowledge can be lost, that institutions can fail, that progress can reverse. In an age where much of our knowledge exists in digital form, dependent on functioning technological infrastructure, and where many skills exist in narrow communities of specialists, we face our own vulnerabilities. The loss of capability in manufacturing, in fundamental research, in practical skills that occurs when economic incentives shift or when institutions fail might, in some future crisis, prove as consequential as the loss of Gupta knowledge was for medieval India. Democratic backsliding and institutional erosion in many countries today can be understood through the lens of the Gupta experience. Institutions depend not just on formal structures, but on informal norms, on shared commitment to collective goods, on trust between citizens and government, and among citizens themselves. When these erode, when elites prioritize their individual interests over systemic stability, when citizens lose faith in institutions, the cascade toward dysfunction can be difficult to arrest. The Gupta Empire's descent from golden age to fragmentation over just a few generations serves as a cautionary tale about how quickly institutional decay can occur. Yet the Gupta story also offers grounds for measured optimism. Cultural traditions proved more resilient than political structures. Knowledge survived, adapted, and eventually flourished in new contexts. The mathematical innovations of the Gupta period contributed to human understanding for centuries after the empire fell. The artistic traditions influenced civilizations across Asia. The philosophical and religious ideas continued to provide meaning and guidance to communities. This suggests that even in the face of political collapse, what is most valuable about a civilization, its ideas and innovations, its art and literature, its accumulated wisdom, can endure. The key insight is that different aspects of civilization have different levels of resilience. Political structures tend to be the most fragile, dependent as they are on specific configurations of power and interest. Economic systems are more resilient, but still vulnerable to disruption of trade networks, monetary systems, and productive infrastructure. Cultural traditions, encoded in texts and practices, and transmitted through personal relationships and community institutions, are the most resilient. But even they require active maintenance. Communities committed to preservation and transmission, and minimum conditions of stability and resources. What this suggests for contemporary concerns is the importance of building resilience at multiple levels. Political institutions need both legitimacy and effectiveness, both popular support and the capacity to address collective challenges. Economic systems need to balance efficiency with robustness, integration with local self-sufficiency. Cultural institutions, education systems, libraries, museums, universities, artistic communities need support and independence. The resources to function, but not dependence on any single patron or political structure. What they could not do, despite occasional efforts, was recreate the scale and unity of the Gupta Empire. Political unity on that scale would not return to India until the Mughal Empire in the 16th century. And even then, it came through foreign conquest rather than indigenous development. This represents one of the most significant long-term consequences of the Gupta collapse. The fragmentation of the Indian subcontinent became normalized, embedded in political culture and institutional structures in ways that proved remarkably persistent. Yet political fragmentation did not mean civilizational collapse in the broader sense. In many ways, the regional kingdoms that succeeded the Gupta Empire presided over their own cultural flourishing. Sanskrit literature continued to be produced, though now in multiple regional centers, rather than primarily at an imperial court. Temple architecture developed in spectacular directions, with regional styles emerging in places like Khajuraho, Konark, and later in the great temple complexes of South India. Hindu devotional movements, known as Bhakti, emerged in South India and gradually spread northward, transforming religious practice in ways that made it more accessible to ordinary people while preserving connection to the Sanskrit textual tradition. The survival and evolution of these cultural elements in the absence of political unity raises fascinating questions about the relationship between political power and cultural achievement. The conventional narrative suggests that great civilizations require strong states, that cultural flowering depends on imperial patronage and the resources that centralized power can mobilize. The post-Gupta experience suggests a more complex reality. Cultural traditions can persist and evolve through distributed networks of patronage, through temple institutions and local courts, through the commitment of communities to preserve and transmit their heritage. The loss of imperial unity weakened certain cultural institutions, particularly those requiring large-scale resources. But it did not prevent cultural vitality at smaller scales. This is perhaps most evident in the realm of intellectual achievement. The mathematical and astronomical traditions that had developed under the Guptas continued, though in altered form. The knowledge was preserved in texts copied by scribes in monastery and temple libraries. Teachers transmitted techniques to students in relationships that spanned generations. Innovations continued to occur, though perhaps less frequently than during the Golden Age. Crucially, this knowledge began to travel beyond India. The mechanism of transmission was primarily through Islamic scholars who encountered Indian mathematical texts during the early centuries of Muslim expansion. Arab merchants who traded with Indian ports, Muslim rulers who controlled territories that had once been part of the Gupta Empire, scholars who traveled in search of knowledge, all played roles in this transmission. By the 8th and 9th centuries, Indian mathematical and astronomical works were being translated into Arabic in Baghdad and other centers of Islamic learning. The process of transmission was neither simple nor instantaneous. It required individuals who were knowledgeable in both Indian and Islamic intellectual traditions, who could not only translate language, but adapt concepts and methods to new contexts. The earliest translators sometimes struggled with Indian mathematical notation and terminology, having to invent Arabic equivalents for concepts that had no direct analogues in the mathematical traditions they knew. But gradually, through the work of scholars like Al-Khwarizmi in the 9th century, who wrote extensively on Indian mathematical methods, the knowledge became integrated into Islamic mathematics. The consequences were momentous. The decimal place value system with zero, which had been developed in India, was adopted by Islamic mathematicians who recognized its superiority over the systems they had inherited from Greek and Persian sources. This system allowed for arithmetic calculations of unprecedented ease and power. Problems that had been cumbersome or impossible with earlier notation systems became straightforward. The ability to represent any number, no matter how large or small, using just 10 symbols arranged according to place value, was revolutionary. It enabled the development of more sophisticated algebra and eventually calculus. From the Islamic world, these ideas eventually reached medieval Europe, where they were initially known as Arabic numerals, though their ultimate origin in India was sometimes acknowledged. The adoption process in Europe was gradual and sometimes contentious. European scholars, trained in Roman numerals and calculating boards, resisted the new system. But by the late medieval period, the advantages were too clear to ignore. Commerce, accounting, scientific calculation, all benefited enormously from the Indian system transmitted through Islamic civilization. Similarly, Indian astronomical texts influenced Islamic astronomy, which in turn influenced European astronomy in the late medieval and early modern periods. Trigonometric techniques, particularly the use of sine functions, which were developed in India, became standard tools for astronomical calculation throughout the Islamic world and eventually in Europe. Methods for calculating planetary positions, techniques for predicting eclipses, and theoretical concepts about the cosmos all traveled along these routes of transmission. The astronomy that would eventually enable the Copernican revolution and the scientific revolution more broadly built on foundations that included crucial contributions from Gupta Indian scholars. The full extent of Indian influence on the development of mathematics and astronomy in other civilizations is still being documented by historians of science. For many years, the role of Indian mathematics was underappreciated in Western histories of science, which tended to emphasize Greek and later European contributions. Recent scholarship has corrected this imbalance, revealing the crucial importance of Indian innovations and the complex networks of transmission that carried ideas across civilizational boundaries. What becomes clear is that the development of mathematics and science was never a simple linear progression within a single tradition, but a global process of exchange, adaptation, and synthesis. The artistic legacy of the Gupta period proved equally influential, though in different ways. Gupta sculpture, with its characteristic grace and serenity, established aesthetic standards that influenced Indian art for centuries. More surprisingly, Gupta artistic styles traveled across maritime trade routes to Southeast Asia, where they profoundly shaped the development of temple architecture and sculpture. The great temple complexes of Cambodia, particularly Angkor Wat, and the stupas of Java, particularly Borobudur, all show clear influence from Gupta and post-Gupta Indian artistic traditions. This transmission occurred through a combination of direct political influence, as Indian traders and priests established themselves in Southeast Asian courts, and cultural prestige, as Southeast Asian rulers sought to adopt the sophisticated civilization of India. The legal and philosophical texts produced during the Gupta period also had lasting influence. The Dharma Stras, compilations of Hindu law and ethics, continued to shape legal practice and moral reasoning in Hindu communities for centuries. The philosophical schools that had debated in Guptara courts continued their arguments in monasteries and temple complexes, refining their positions and producing new commentaries on ancient texts. These traditions would eventually encounter and interact with Islamic philosophy when Muslim rule was established in parts of India, creating new syntheses that enriched both traditions. What we see, then, is a pattern where the collapse of political structure did not entail the collapse of culture, at least not in any simple or total sense. Cultural traditions proved more resilient than political institutions. They adapted to new patrons, new contexts, new competitors. Some elements were lost, certainly. The particular synthesis of Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditions that had characterized the Gupta Golden Age never recurred in quite the same form. The institutional support for cutting-edge scientific inquiry was diminished, but much survived, transformed, and sometimes thrived. This resilience of culture in the face of political collapse offers both comfort and caution. The comfort is that human achievement is not entirely dependent on particular political structures. Ideas, artistic traditions, and social practices can survive the fall of empires and adapt to new circumstances. The caution is that we should not be complacent about this resilience. What survived from the Gupta collapse was often what was most easily transmitted through texts and oral traditions. What could be supported by distributed networks of patronage? What did not require large-scale institutional infrastructure? Other elements, including some that might have been equally valuable, were lost. The question of what was permanently lost deserves consideration. The political unity of northern India, as mentioned, was not restored for a millennium. The consequences of this fragmentation were significant. Resources that might have been invested in infrastructure, in institutional development, in collective goods like defense or irrigation systems, were instead consumed by near-constant warfare among competing kingdoms. The economic integration that had facilitated long-distance trade and specialization was diminished. The ability to undertake large-scale projects, whether physical, like major irrigation works, or intellectual, like maintaining multiple research institutions, was reduced.